Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome back to the second part of the MTG Arena set review for the new set War of the Spark. Today we continue with the second part of the white cards after we talked about the first half yesterday, which you can find on my channel page and in the playlist. I also put a link to the playlist down below in the description. One last thing before we get started. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification icon if you're new to the channel to not miss out on the rest of the series. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so first we have Makeshift Battalion. It's a 3-mana 3/2 that whenever it attacks with at least 2 other creatures, you put a +1/+1 counter on Makeshift Battalion. So kind of a typical mechanic for Boros card, so this is kind of a Boros card, even though this is not technically a specific Ravnica set, although it is still playing in Ravnica, as we can see from the art and some of the mechanics. So yeah, we have seen this mechanic on cards like Hasda Marshal in the Ravnica block before, and also in an older Ravnica set. So yeah, clearly not a constructed card, but in Limited I think this is a pretty solid 3-drop. The Limited development is going heavily towards 3-mana 3/2s as kind of a good design benchmark. There's a pretty nice blog post on Ari Lex's blog. If you haven't seen that, maybe go check it out, where he talks intensively about why kind of centering your Limited design around 3-mana 3/2s is the sweet spot and a really good thing to do that leads to a lot of interesting long-term replayable gameplay in the Limited formats. And yeah, this is a particularly good 3-mana 3/2. The ability, while not that easy to trigger, makes this actually really good once you get to trigger it, especially if you're more aggressive and have like 1-drops and stuff. Go like 1-drop, 2-drop, Makeshift Battalion, and then you basically get like a conditional 3-mana 4/3 that, if it survives the first combat, might even grow larger, which is pretty strong for a common. So all in all, this seems like a pretty good 3-drop common in an aggressive white deck in Limited. On to the next card. Next we have Martyr for the Cause. It's just basically your typical 2-mana 2/2, but it has a die trigger. When it dies, you proliferate. So we have seen already some cards with Proliferate again, and Proliferate is making kind of a secondary mechanical comeback in this set as an additional mechanic from the past. Usually we've seen in the last sets that there is often like an old mechanic that is kind of general enough that it's not too set specific, brought back in like a minor capacity in new sets to kind of weave it more into the like kind of fabric of Magic basically. And Proliferate has nice synergy, especially with the whole Planeswalker theme, and especially with the uncommon Planeswalkers that have no plus ability. So yeah, this is nothing special, not a constructed card, but I would assume that it's at least pretty playable in Limited and a decent role player. Then we have Parhelion II. It's a vehicle. There is one in all or most colors in this set, like a legendary vehicle. I can think of at least 3, like a blue one, a red one, and a white one. Not sure if there was a black and a green one. There might not be. I'm not 100% sure right now, but we'll see once we get to those colors. This is definitely the most expensive. 8 mana is a lot, so I don't see this making it into constructed. Almost certainly, because it's just 8 is just way too much. In Limited, even in Limited, it is really expensive, but it is really powerful. So if you get there, the card will win you the game. It has crew 4, which is kind of quite a bunch for crew, but the payoff is totally worth it. First of all, it has flying, first strike, and vigilance, so you can attack with it, and if you have enough crew potential, you can also block with it. And if it attacks, you create 2 basically Zera Angel tokens, 4/4 flying vigilance tokens, just from attacking with it once. So yeah, the card is really powerful, runs away with the game really fast, so quite a bomb, but the 8 mana converted casting cost kind of hold it back quite a bit, because even in Limited this is really a lot. But yeah, if your deck is slow and defensive enough, that you think you can reliably get to 8 mana and play an 8-drop before the game is over, either positively or negatively, then this is a great win condition, I think. But yeah, more often than not, I think this will not even make your limited deck, unfortunately, due to the cost. But maybe the format is slow enough that it is better than usual. Then we have Pouncing Lynx. It's a 2-mana 2/1, and as long as it's your turn, it has first strike. So it's basically the same as I think Boros Legionnaire was the name, like the Boros colored hybrid 2-drop that does the same. This time it's not red or white, it's just white, so it's a bit more limited. But yeah, in limited, pretty solid card in an aggressive deck. I really liked the 2/1 first strike on your turn guy, and I doubt it will be any different in this set if you have an aggressive deck. So we'll have to see. We have seen a couple of nice kind of aggressively slanted white creatures, so it's very possible that there is a solid white aggressive limited archetype, and then Pouncing Lynx fits right in. Next we have Prison Realm, kind of the latest take on the whole white exile removal Oblivion Ring type stuff. This is not quite Oblivion Ring, it can only target creatures or planeswalkers, but it has a Scry 1 attached, which is a pretty neat bonus, and at least in limited, more often than not, planeswalkers and creatures are what you care about the most. We will see a lot more cards that can target planeswalkers in the set for obvious reasons, because there are so many and you need generic answers. So a lot of things that will be able to target creatures will also target planeswalkers to make them kind of as answerable in a way as a lot of creatures are, to not make them too dominating. Especially now that they also have these static abilities that impact the game just from lying around. So yeah, 3 mana is kind of a typical cost for this effect. The 2 mana versions usually are restricted in what they can target, and this one is not restricted in terms of what creatures it can target, and also targets planeswalkers and also gives us a Scry 1, so pretty good. This might also be decent in Constructed, but is probably, at least for now, overshadowed by Conclave Tribunal, because Tribunal costs 1 more, but the fact that it has Convoke makes it effectively probably cost half a mana less. I would say Convoke cards are usually more than 1 mana expensive than a non-Convoke version, because they are so much easier to play, and a 4 mana Convoke removal is effectively more playable, more supportable, more castable than a 3 mana non-Convoke. And also Tribunal can target anything, like Wilderness Reclamation, Experimental Frenzy, all that stuff that Prison Realm can't. But once Tribunal leaves, Prison Realm would probably become a bit more desirable, and Scry is always nice to have. So we'll see if it might become more relevant and Constructed down the line, but for now it's just overshadowed by better options. And in Limited, it's a great removal, easy first pick, especially in a format with so many planeswalkers. Then we have Rally of Wings. It's a 2 mana instant. You untap all creatures you control, and creatures you control with flying get +2/+2. So it's kind of like these 2 parts. It always does something, but if you don't have a lot of flyers, the card is really weak. If you have quite a lot of flyers, the card actually seems pretty strong. You can use it offensively, defensively. It's fairly cheap, costing only 2 to untap all your creatures and buff some of them is a pretty good rate. So basically, yeah, I think if your deck has a decent amount of flyers, this card seems pretty powerful. Otherwise, it probably seems too weak, and 2 mana is kind of a sweet spot for this effect. Often, these types of cards cost 3 or something, 3 or 4 to untap all your creatures. Like in Ravnica Allegiance, we had the 4 mana +1/+3 to all your creatures and untap them, and this costs half and gives a better buff if the creature is flying. So if your deck is flyer heavy, this card seems pretty amazing to me, honestly. It would already be decent if it would just untap and +2/+2 a single creature, like the Green Combat trick that existed in the past, and this just doing it to all your untapping all your creatures and giving the buff to multiple creatures if you have more than 1 flying creature is pretty devastating. There seems like there are some really cheap and potentially devastating white tricks that heavily dictate how how aggressive and how yeah, how risky you can go in limited with your combat. So gotta be really aware of this when playing limited in this format. Next we have Ravnica at War. 4 mana, single white, exile all multicolored permanents. Bit of a unique effect here. We'll have to see how this plays out in limited, given that a fair share of the planeswalkers are like hybrid and multicolor, and we don't have that many multicolor cards in the end, so this seems like it will often just be kind of a niche planeswalker removal that can kill some planeswalkers, but not even all of them. And for 4 mana, that's not that great. And in Constructed, I feel like this seems very narrow, and there's a possibility that there might be like some kind of multicolor heavy deck in the new format that this might be a decent sideboard card against or something, but it's just too narrow and too specific all in all, I think, to see a whole lot of play in either format. Then we have Rising Populace, 3 mana 2/2, and whenever another creature or planeswalker you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Rising Populace. We know this. We had this card in the past as a 2 mana 1/1, and only growing from creatures in, I think, the last or 2 Innistrad sets ago. And this is kind of just a new take, a bit bigger baseline, which is pretty good because the 3 mana 2/2 is definitely a better baseline than a 2 mana 1/1. And the fact that it also grows from planeswalkers makes it grow a little better and a little faster. So yeah, seems like a fine card in limited. Probably nothing amazing, but solid and not a constructed card. Then we have Single Combat. 5 mana sorcery. Each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control and then sacrifices all other creatures and planeswalkers. And players can't cast creatures or planeswalkers until the end of your next turn. So that means you can't play another planeswalker or creature after you play this, but to be fair, you could do it before, but then you have to sack it. So it kind of makes sure that none of the players gets an unfair advantage. You're still the first that gets to play something. It kind of like benefits the caster of Single Combat a bit more, because it's a lot harder for you to play Single Combat and another planeswalker or creature at the same turn. While if you play Single Combat, then the opponent would get the first chance to get back onto the board and pull ahead. And this is what the card wants to avoid. So you are the one that gets to rebuild first, which is kind of nice, but the card seems a bit situational, but I could see that there could maybe be some kind of mid-range decks that have a bunch of really good creatures and or planeswalkers, just using this to soft reset the board, buy themselves some time, maybe even have like a planeswalker with a creature destruction ability or defensive ability, and then you just Single Combat, and then you kind of just answer the creature that the opponent has left, especially against a deck that doesn't have planeswalkers of their own. And then you can just really pull ahead on the next turn. So it seems like an interesting tool for mid-range decks potentially. It doesn't fit into any existing decks, but maybe there will be a new deck that wants this kind of effect. And yeah, in limited, seems like a decent card. Sweeper type effects are always powerful in limited, and you can set this up really well and even potentially better than normal sweepers and can get a bigger advantage out of it. So seems like a fairly strong card in limited that can really catch people off guard and pull you way ahead. So I would at least initially pick that fairly highly and try it out to see how well it plays, because it's a bit of a different card from what we're used to. So it needs some testing, some experimenting. Then we have Sunblade Angel, another limited only card. It's a 6 mana 3/3 flying, first strike, vigilance, lifelink. It's not that big for a 6-drop, but with all the abilities, it's pretty dominant in the skies. It beats a lot of opposing flyers. It works really well with any kind of buffing and tricks. And the lifelink makes it also really hard to kind of raise, and it really kind of pulls you ahead and gives you a buffer if it just attacks for a couple turns in the air. So yeah, seems like a pretty strong uncommon, a bit costly. 6 mana is quite a bunch, and depending on how big the creatures on the other side are, not being able to block can put you behind, but all in all, it seems like at least a pretty good uncommon for limited. And then we have the first uncommon planeswalker to talk about, Teyo the Shieldmage. It's a 3 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker. A lot of the uncommon planeswalkers have this template of like costing 3 and having 5 loyalty. A static ability, in this case you have hexproof, and then a -2 ability that they can use twice without killing themselves. And then sticking around as like a 1 loyalty planeswalker that with a proliferate can be used a 3rd time and then dies, or just sticks around as kind of like an enchantment. This one is pretty underwhelming because the -2 just gives you an 0/3 wall token with Defender that doesn't really synergize much with the hexproof ability. Doesn't really get you that much advantage because an 0/3 can only block like early game creatures and doesn't do that good of a job. Also doesn't block flyers. So yeah, this seems really weak. I don't have particularly high hopes for this card in limited and constructed really. Seems like one of the worst planeswalkers that I can think of right now in the set off the top of my head. It is really underwhelming. So yeah, but I mean, with 36 planeswalkers in a set, there have to be bad ones. Can't make all good and strong planeswalkers. That would turn into a disaster. Then we have Teyo's familiar. Basically, each planeswalker has like a spell or a creature that with its name in it, and that is kind of like flavor related to the planeswalker. And in this case, it's an 0/3. Just like the walls that Teyo makes, but this is not a wall and it doesn't have Defender. It costs 3, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Yeah, pretty weak card. Effectively 1/4 in stats for 3. Not great. And sure, you can either make it like a 1/4 or put the counter somewhere else. But given that we live in a world where you kind of get like 2 mana 1/4s occasionally, at common, the slightly better Horned Turtle is really outdated, and this card is seems pretty bad to me even in limited. Next we have Tomik, Distinguished Advokist, double white, 2/3, and flying, so pretty good stats there really, like a 2/3 flyer for 2. Pretty nice, seems like solid stat line for constructed. The ability is not that relevant, at least in standard. In older formats, it also has some nice utility there. Lands on the battlefield and land cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities your opponents control. And your opponents can't play land cards from graveyards. Cards like Crucible of Worlds come to mind, Strip Mine, Wasteland, that sort of stuff. So yeah, this is a card that is clearly aimed more at long-term, aimed more at like Legacy and Vintage, not even that much at Modern probably. But yeah, even in Standard, double white, 2/3 flying, this seems like a very reasonable alternative in White Weenie in Standard over Tithe Taker, just because getting a flyer is good, getting a high toughness creature is good. This blocks the early creatures from mono red. It doesn't die to shock, so they need like one of their 3 damage spells to kill it, and once you put a counter on it with Loxodon, it's suddenly a 3/4 and really hard to kill, so this seems like a great addition for White Weenie. And especially since there are some lists that don't even want 4 2-drops, I could easily see just running like 3 Tomik and another 1-drop, for example, if you don't want 4 of him. But since he's a 2-drop, so he is more likely to die easier and quicker, you can even potentially run 4 and not be hurt too much by multiple copies, because the first copy will often die anyway, especially because of the flying, so the opponent can't just ignore it because they can't stall it on the ground, so they are even more incentivized to kill it. So yeah, seems like a very solid addition for constructed, based alone on the fact that it's a 2/3 flying for 2 really. Then we have Topple the Statue. It's 3 mana, tap target permanent, draw a card. if the permanent is an artifact, you get to destroy it. There are a couple of decent artifacts in this set, so in limited you can sometimes nice main deck artifact removal here. The main catch is really that this is kind of designed a bit for like best of one limited, allowing you to run artifact removal in the main deck against some of the powerful vehicles, for example, even in best of one queues on Arena, without much of a downside, since the card is actually fine without an artifact and great if they have an artifact, basically. In Constructed, however, just killing an artifact is probably a bit too niche. There are also not a lot of artifacts you want to kill in Constructed, otherwise it might be a decent sideboard card, but as of now it is not, I think. Now we have Trusted Pegasus. This, I would argue, a bit better version of like the typical Concordia Pegasus. Since this is a 2/2, not a 1/3, and otherwise it does the same. When Trusted Pegasus attacks, target attacking creature without flying gains flying until end of turn. So yeah, this just is a bit better threat on its own than the 1/3 version of this card, making it even better in Limited, and the 1/3 version in Limited already was a really good common or uncommon in the sets it was in as Rock Charger or Pegasus. So yeah, premium common here, one of the top white commons, almost certainly. Another uncommon Planeswalker, same template, but 1 mana more, this time the 4 mana card. Prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and other permanents you control. So that's kind of a neat bonus, especially because the ability is pretty good. You exile target creature with power 4 or greater, so getting two removal out of this potentially is amazing, especially for the cost. Like, it's basically a 4 mana removal, which is not that great in Constructed technically, but in Limited still decent, especially with the fact that you can use it again next turn, and that you have the static ability that can come in handy, and if you somehow get a counter on it by proliferating or something, you can even use it a third time. Granted, power 4 or greater is limited, and these removals, the viability of this type of removal has varied heavily in Limited, and will need some experience with the format to see how many targets there usually are in decks to get a better evaluation on this. But all in all, this seems pretty good for an uncommon Planeswalker, and even has some potential to make it into Constructed, I could imagine, maybe as like a sideboard card, as a one-off against like rule decks, for example, or something like the type of decks that just has have a bunch of targets for this, and then this is just a really nice grindy card. So yeah, pretty solid Planeswalker for an uncommon. And then we have the namesake spell, Wanderer's Strike, the 5 mana sorcery, exile target creature, and then you proliferate. So quite expensive for 5 mana, but it's unconditional and even exiles, which is pretty nice. And proliferate, we already mentioned, has quite some solid value. So without the proliferate, this might even cost only 4, so throwing in the proliferate there makes the 5 pretty reasonable for a limited removal. We are used to a lot of similar 5 mana removal, like in Guild of Ravnica there's the Dead Revels, I think it's called. No, not Dead Revels, but like the 5 mana black removal that destroys target creature and surveils for 2. This exiles it even, costs a single white, so it's very splashable, and has proliferate, which is probably similarly valuable in the specific Planeswalker heavy format than, say, Surveil 2. So seems like a pretty solid common removal in Limited, very splashable. And last but not least, we have War Screecher, a 2 mana 1/3 flying, which is decent. Normally we know this as like vanilla. By the way, Concordia Pegasus that I earlier mentioned is not the 1/3 3 mana that gives flying. It's the 2 mana 1/3 with flying with no other ability. So my mistake there. And this is basically a better Concordia Pegasus, since it also has an ability. It's a late game mana sink type ability, but it still kind of makes it a bit more impactful than the typical vanilla 2 mana 1/3 flying. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn for 6 mana, and tapping War Screecher making it kind of a nice trick and or damage boost later. So all in all, this seems like a very solid common 2-drop in white decks, especially in more defensive decks, but possibly also in more offensive decks. Also clearly not a constructed card. Alright, this concludes the second half of the white cards. Tomorrow we're gonna start on the first half of the blue cards. Hope you guys are enjoying the series so far and like my assessment of the cards. Let me know in the comments what you think of the cards, where you agree or disagree and why. Let's have a bit of a discussion about the new cards in the new set. Always happy to hear what other people think. And yeah, as usual, before you leave, if you enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notification icon to not miss out on the rest of the series. Share it with your friends and so on and so forth. And one last request, if you want to help support us content creators for free, please consider whitelisting YouTube on your adblock or just turning it off to help support the free content. That would really mean a lot. Alright, that's it again for this time. I'm your host ManuS. I thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye.